Hello, welcome back to my channel. This is Blueprint Design and I'm Nikhil. And in this video, we're going to talk about prototyping in user experience. So as you may know, we are in the middle of a UX case study and my topic is language translation. And I've shared quite a few videos talking about the entire design process that I'm following. So you can follow along the design process from research to analysis to design, and then later we'll also talk about testing phase. So if you haven't watched all my previous videos and if you have any questions, watch those videos. The link is down in the description. And if you have any questions, feel free to comment. I'll be sure to get back to you. So as I mentioned, I've actually shared a lot of videos already about the design phase. For example, user flows, information architecture, wireframes, creating design systems, and now we're going to talk about prototypes. In this video, I'm going to be talking about what is a prototype, why to use prototypes, when should be using prototype, what are the different types of prototypes, and some recommendations and some mistakes to avoid. And then in the end, I'll also talk about some of the best tools that you can use for prototyping. So stick along till the end and let's get started. So let's talk about what is a prototype. In a nutshell, prototype is basically a simulation or a sample of the final product that you're building or designing, right? The goal of the prototype is to test and validate the ideas that you have been working on before sharing them with the different stakeholders and eventually sharing them or handing them off to the developers to implement those. Now, again, like as we already know, development is expensive. So making changes to a final product is time consuming and it's not straightforward. It's really complex. It's costly. So fixing errors after the fact is very difficult. And that's why we use prototyping so that we are able to find those errors and fix those errors even before we begin development. So you may ask, like, what is a good prototype, or what are the different qualities of a good prototype, right? The first one is the representation. So it's basically the prototype itself, like what kind of a prototype it is, whether it is a paper prototype, a digital prototype, or a coded prototype. And we'll talk about this later in the types of prototypes as well. The next quality is the precision or the level of detail, or as we popularly know, the fidelity, whether it's a low fidelity, whether it's a wireframe, whether it's a high fidelity prototype. They are of different kinds depending on your project and where you are in your project lifecycle. The next quality is the interactivity of the prototype. And it basically means that what functionality is open to the user or the different stakeholders so that they can interact with the prototype. Last but not the least, the quality is evolution, and it's basically the life cycle of the prototype. Like, where how quickly you're building the prototype and testing the prototype with different stakeholders, and if it doesn't work or if you find some errors or like areas of improvement based on the feedback, like how quickly you're throwing it away and then just starting a next prototype, right? So it's basically the evolution of the prototype, like how quickly you build, test, and just disregard it, or you build multiple prototypes and then based on the feedback you kind of combine them with the level of detail and with while fixing those errors in that prototype. Let's talk about why we should be using prototypes in the first place, right? So as popularly said by the most popular design firm IDEO, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings. So the primary reasons why we should be using prototypes in our projects is basically visualization and feedback. So prototypes basically help designers and the different stakeholders to visualize the final product even before we have written even the first line of code, right? So different stakeholders are able to visualize the product and discuss and provide feedback on the product even before we've started implementing it. So getting feedback is the most important goal of the prototype. It doesn't matter how cool your prototype is. The basic function, or the only, I should say, function of a prototype is to get feedback. If you're not getting any feedback, that means you're doing something wrong. Prototypes help in creating or generating feedback from the team members and the different stakeholders. So you can go back and iterate and refine the process and the workflow that you're building. As you see in this diagram, basically you have a prototype, you share it with the different stakeholders, then you get feedback from them on what's working, what's not working, what are the areas that we need to improve, and then again go back to prototyping, and the cycle continues or iterates. So when should we start building a prototype and using prototypes? Well, generally, the best time to make or to start prototyping is in the beginning of the project or the design phase, where once you've gathered all the research and all the feedback from the users, so you can validate those research and those feedback and those pain points through your designs and get feedback again from the users. So if you're still in the research phase and you're trying to understand the problem and trying to gain feedback from your users or stakeholders, then you may want to hold off on starting prototyping at this point. Once you finish gathering feedback or gathering those research points from the users, at this point, I think it's the best idea to start prototyping. There's different levels and different fidelities of the prototypes. I think we've already spoke about those. So you can start prototyping just putting down ideas and solutions on paper, just with a pen and a paper quickly, so that while the research items are fresh in your mind, obviously we document those, but while they're fresh, it's a good idea to just bring down different ideas or different solutions on paper. The quality of the prototype doesn't really matter at this point. It's basically the ideas that matter. So when you get to a point where you have a lot of ideas, then you can think about combining them or refining them or adding more detail to those ideas in the form of low fidelity or high fidelity prototypes. But they create high fidelity prototypes only once the product and the entire workflow, the step-by-step workflow, has been thought out and has been approved by the stakeholders. Because if the workflow hasn't been approved yet, there may be certain items that are critical to the process that you may have missed, and you have to go back to redo all of those work again. So to avoid extra effort and to avoid wasting any more time, it's better to wait and refine the workflow first, fix the user flow, understand the user flow, discuss it and get it approved, and then start creating the high fidelity prototypes. Let's talk about the different types of prototypes. So the first one, I've already mentioned these before, but the first one is a basic paper prototype. And it's, as the name says, you just take a pen and a paper and just start putting down ideas, right? Now this works pretty well during the early design stages, as I mentioned just a moment ago, right? Right after you finish the research phase, and you invite the team to collaborate and explore the ideas. So the team members can basically sketch ideas. The quality of sketches is not at all important, but the ideas and just putting down ideas is more important. So the team members can actually sketch different ideas by hand, and it's basically just easier to be in that flow to put ideas down. And as the important point is, the emphasis should be on generating ideas and not how the sketch looks or aesthetics. The next type is the digital prototype. And again, within the digital prototype, we can say that low fidelity and high fidelity both count as digital prototypes, because we basically use or make use of a digital tool to create these digital prototypes. So once you have those different ideas down on pen and paper, then you may want to bring those into like a wireframe or a low fidelity prototype, just so that you have something that is presentable to the different stakeholders. So you can use low fidelity prototypes to basically allow the larger or the broader stakeholder team to finalize or to refine that user flow and information architecture. And at this point, obviously, with a low fidelity prototype, you don't want to fixate yourself on the typography or the graphics and the color schemes and all of that. It's basically for the user flow and the information architecture. And once you have those figured out, then I think it's better to add or create high fidelity prototypes, adding more detail and so that you can use those detailed prototypes for usability tests or to basically show off in marketing campaigns and whatnot. Point to remember here with digital prototypes is that there may be a learning curve to learn the tool that you're using to create the digital prototype, and also some cost associated with the memberships of that. The next type is the coded prototype. In certain instances, and I say that with quotes, in certain instances, you teams or different teams or may just directly skip creating wireframes or low fidelity prototypes and directly move on to coded prototypes to get more an accurate representation of the product. It's only done in certain cases where the change that we're making in the existing workflow is pretty small and the teams or the developers know exactly what needs to be done. Needless to say, it comes with a considerable time and development cost because we're directly moving to development. And if you apply this to a new product or a new workflow or a new feature in your product, then this may turn out to be a huge disaster. So here, let's look at an example of a digital prototype that I created for one of my case studies earlier. This was a mobile application or a solution that we presented or created for a Trader Joe's using augmented reality and gamification. I'll include a link to the entire case study and my entire process for this project in the descriptions if you want to basically look more into detail. But I just wanted to show that this is just an example of one kind of a digital prototype. We have all the typography, we have all the iconography, the color schemes, the branding. So it may look like it's ready to be shared with different stakeholders. Let's talk about some recommendations or some mistakes to avoid when prototyping or when working on a user experience project. So the very first one that I want to share is that don't settle on a single design idea, let alone the first design idea for your prototype. You may want to get into the habit of creating or working parallelly with multiple ideas, like completely separate ideas for one particular problem, so that you have different solutions or different pathways to come to that problem or solve that problem. The next one is select the right fidelity for your project. Now this depends from project to project and team to team, but selecting the right fidelity means what level of detail you want to add to your wireframe or to your prototype when sharing or working with a project or sharing or working with different stakeholders. So if, for example, you're just working on a small change, in this case, it's better to just create a quick prototype and share it with the team to see what they think about that change. And everybody knows from the requirements that it's a small change. So it's okay to be quickly do rapid prototyping, and a low fidelity or a wireframe works just fine. But if you're working on a new feature or a new product altogether, then I think following the process from wireframes to low fidelity then to the high fidelity prototype makes sense, because at every point in time you want to gather feedback and refine that workflow and refine the prototype, so that when it time comes to handing the prototype off to the developers, you know that the process is embedded within the prototype. The next one is practice rapid prototyping and iterative design. Again, this we've already talked about from like point 1 and 2, is when you don't just settle on the first idea, work on multiple ideas and work on repetitive ideas. So prototyping is this constant process of working on and constantly improving that prototype and the design, so that you can have, or you can gather more feedback, and ultimately going back to iterate on that prototype again. The next one, and I think it's really important, is to detect unintended scenarios. Now, normally when you're working on a design, you kind of get so caught up with the small details of the design that we forget that we've only worked on that happy path of the workflow. But in reality, when the product finally ships to the user, there are more parts than just that happy path. There may be certain errors that you want to consider, or how you want to handle it. You have to define those so that the user doesn't have, or they're not stuck, right? So you have to consider all the different scenarios, and more importantly, the unintended ones. Does your workflow lead to any undesirable outcome? You have to think about that as well. The next one is detect the usability problems right in the beginning when you're working on the prototype. Part of our job as UX designers is to provide and is to design better products with better usability and improve on the user experience. So it basically starts from the prototype as well. So you want to basically think about and just take a step back and look at it from a different lens, so that you are able to detect the usability problems and fix those early on in the process. A quick side note, as designers, we're not designing products for ourselves. It's basically for others and to improve their lives and their tasks, right? Although it's difficult to take criticism on your design, I think it's really important to get feedback on your designs, because ultimately it's going to help the user. Finally, let's talk about some of the tools that you can use for prototyping and creating or designing user interfaces. So this is in no particular order of ranking or popularity, but I'm just listing them down here. So the first one is Figma. It's available for Mac OS, it's available for Windows, and it also works on your browser. It's a really robust tool to create wireframes, to create prototypes, to create mockups and share them, and hand them off to developers as well. The next product or the next tool from Adobe is Adobe XD. Again, it's really similar to Figma. It's robust. It integrates really well into the larger creative suite, works really well with Adobe Photoshop to create different graphics or different assets, or your Creative Cloud libraries. And it also works with Mac OS, Windows, and most browsers as well. The next one is Sketch. It's also a really robust tool to create wireframes, to create low fidelity prototypes or even high fidelity prototypes and share them with the developers. But the only catch is that it's only available for Mac OS. I hope they make it available for Windows and just cross-platform as well. The next one is InVision. InVision has really grown, because in the earlier days they were only an interactive tool to create prototypes, not the actual artboards or not the actual screens. But I think lately they've actually created or grown a lot to become this robust tool and all-in-one tool so that you can create artboards and designs and screens, and also add those interactive elements and share them with the developers. The next one is Framer, and it's similar to InVision. Again, it's also available. It's an prototyping tool available for Mac, Windows, and all the browsers. In my projects or in my day-to-day life, I think I've used Figma, Adobe XD, and Sketch a lot, and InVision to an extent. I haven't used Framer personally, but I've heard that it's really popular and it's a good tool to use as well. And obviously there's so many tools coming to life lately that it's hard to keep a tab off. It doesn't matter what tool you're using. I just wanted to point that out. The final goal is to create or solve problems for the users, and so it really doesn't matter what tool you're using as long as that tool is able to help you fulfill that promise of helping or working towards solving problems for your users. So that's all for this video. I hope this was helpful. If you like this video, please leave a like down below. It really helps me. I'm just being selfish here. I love to see those likes. And if you like this video, please subscribe to this channel. I've already shared so many videos about the design process, and I'm also going to be sharing more videos in the future. So you may not want to miss those. Share this video with your friends, with your classmates, with your colleagues, so they can learn about prototyping and start prototyping early on in their process. If you have any questions, feel free to comment down below. I'll try my best to answer those. And if you want to book a one-on-one call with me, there's a link down in the description. If you have any questions about your design process, or if you want to have a one-on-one chat with me about your project, about your capstone project, or your design process, like if you're stuck or you need feedback, just click the link down in the description and book a call with me. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much.